Doctor, I never thought I was the problem, but now I can't shake the feeling that everything that happened, it was all because of me. John sat across from me, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair as if he needed something solid to hold on to. His eyes, restless and clouded with doubt, darted around the room before settling on the floor. He was a man who had spent years convinced of his own righteousness, only to wake up one day and realize the weight of his own choices. I always worked hard. I showed up on time, stayed late, did more than was asked of me. But no matter how much effort I put in, it was never enough. My boss overlooked me for promotions. My employees underperformed. Customers complained. And every time something went wrong, I knew exactly whose fault it was. Never mine. The bitterness in his voice was undeniable. But beneath it, there was something else, something fragile, like a man standing at the edge of a revelation he wasn't sure he wanted to have. It got to the point where I dreaded walking into the store. I'd already be angry before I even stepped inside. I could predict it, someone would have messed up an order, or left shelves half-stocked, or taken an unscheduled break. And the moment it happened, I felt it, this surge of frustration, of disappointment. I wanted to shake them, make them understand how their laziness was ruining everything. A pause. His jaw tightened. Then she walked in. His hands curled slightly, as if holding something invisible. He leaned forward, his voice dropping, as if afraid the walls might overhear. She wasn't like our usual customers. Something about her. I don't know, maybe it was the way she looked at me. Like she already knew who I was. She bought something small, some kitchen gadget, I think, but before she left, she stopped and looked right at me. John's breath slowed, the memory wrapping around him like a cold wind. She said, "You blame them because it's easier than blaming yourself. But you'll never change anything that way." The words hung in the air between us. I could see how they had lodged themselves deep inside him, refusing to be ignored. I laughed at her. I thought, who does this woman think she is? She doesn't know me, doesn't know how hard I work. But then she smiled, and it wasn't cruel or smug, it was like she was waiting for me to figure something out. And she said, "Let's play a game. Every time you feel like blaming someone else, write it down. Then ask yourself, what could I have done differently?" A dry chuckle escaped him, but there was no humor in it. I thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard. A game? Like I had time for that. But that night, lying in bed, her words kept playing in my head. And the next day, when my assistant messed up a delivery, I felt the anger rise in me, just like always. But instead of snapping at him, I grabbed a piece of paper and wrote it down. Jake forgot to double-check the order. And then, for the first time, I asked myself, what could I have done differently? His voice grew quiet. I could have trained him better. I could have given him clearer instructions. I could have checked in with him instead of assuming he knew exactly what to do. John exhaled, shaking his head as if still struggling to accept the truth of his own words. That was the first time I realized, I wasn't just angry at them. I was angry at myself. For not being the leader I thought I was. For expecting people to know things I never actually taught them. For blaming everyone else so I didn't have to admit that maybe I wasn't as good as I believed. A long silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of his confession. Then, his voice, barely more than a whisper. "Doctor, what if she was right?" John shifted in his chair, his fingers tracing the seam of his pants as if trying to steady himself. His voice was quieter now, less defensive. I kept playing the game. His eyes flicked up to meet mine for a second before he looked away again, his shoulders rising with a deep inhale. At first, it was just to prove to myself that it was stupid. I thought, fine. I'll write it down. I'll prove to myself that these mistakes aren't my fault. So every time something went wrong, I grabbed a notepad. The cashier forgot to count the register properly. The stock boy left an entire shipment in the back instead of putting it on the shelves. The assistant manager didn't schedule enough staff for the afternoon rush. His jaw tightened, the memory still fresh. But then, I started asking the second question. What could I have done differently? And I hated the answers. His voice turned rough, edged with something raw. I could have trained the cashier better instead of assuming he knew what to do. I could have checked on the stock myself instead of waiting until a customer complained. I could have reviewed the schedule before it became a problem. Every time I wrote something down, the pattern got clearer. It wasn't just them. It was me. John let out a sharp breath, rubbing the back of his neck. The worst part? No one even noticed I was doing it. No one knew I was fighting this war in my own head, struggling with every little revelation. To them, I was still just the same old John. The manager with high expectations. The guy who never let mistakes slide. His fingers drummed against the arm of the chair. But I noticed. And that was enough to change everything. The tension in his body shifted, his muscles no longer coiled so tightly. A week after I started the game, I caught myself before I opened my mouth. A delivery came in late, and my first instinct was to yell at the driver. But before I could, I thought, what could I have done differently? A pause. I could have confirmed the order time. Could have followed up when I saw the delay. Could have had a backup plan. So instead of unloading on the driver, I took a breath and asked what happened. Turns out, there was a mix-up at the warehouse. Nothing he could have done about it. And just like that, the anger was gone. John leaned back, his hands now resting still in his lap. It was like I had spent years fighting a storm, screaming into the wind, and suddenly, I realized I could just step inside. A quiet chuckle, more amazed than amused. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, but something shifted. My employees stopped bracing themselves when I walked in. People started coming to me with problems before they became disasters. The tension in the store, it eased. And for the first time in years, I actually liked being at work. His voice softened, the weight of his own words settling over him. And then she came back. He swallowed, shaking his head slightly, as if still trying to make sense of it. She walked in like she'd never left, went straight to the counter, bought another small item. I watched her the whole time, waiting to see if she'd say something. And just as she was about to leave, she looked at me again. Same knowing expression. Same small smile. She didn't ask if I played the game. Didn't check if I'd learned anything. She just nodded. Like she already knew. John let out a long breath, rubbing his palms against his jeans. I wanted to thank her. Wanted to tell her how much she'd changed things. But before I could say anything, she was gone. He looked up at me then, his eyes clearer than before. I don't know who she was. I don't know why she picked me. But I think she gave me something I didn't even know I needed. He paused, considering his next words carefully. The chance to be better. A moment of silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, but full, charged with the weight of realization, of growth, of something new taking root inside him. And then, almost as an afterthought, a small, thoughtful smile played at the corners of his mouth. You know, doctor. I used to think strength was about never being wrong. But now, I think it's about being able to admit when you are. John exhaled slowly, staring at a point just beyond me, lost in thought. I thought the hardest part was realizing I was part of the problem. Turns out, the real challenge was changing how I reacted when things went wrong. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tapping lightly, a nervous habit, or maybe just the energy of someone still adjusting to a new way of thinking. The first time I truly put it to the test was a Monday morning. I walked into the store, and everything was a mess. The shelves were half-stocked, the register was short, and an entire shipment of produce had been left in the back, starting to spoil. My stomach dropped. My first instinct was to go off on everyone, demand to know how they could screw up so badly when I'd made my expectations clear. I actually felt my hands curl into fists. His lips pressed together, reliving the moment. But then, I caught myself. I took a breath. Instead of barking orders or launching into a lecture, I grabbed my notepad and wrote it down. The store is a disaster. And then I asked myself, what could I have done differently? His jaw clenched, and a dry chuckle escaped him. I didn't like the answer. I could have followed up with the night shift instead of assuming they'd finished the job. I could have made sure the new cashier knew how to count the register before leaving him alone. I could have checked the stockroom before closing, instead of trusting someone else would do it. John let out a breath, shaking his head. So instead of storming in like a wrecking ball, I gathered the team. Told them what had gone wrong, but also admitted where I had fallen short. And something weird happened. His fingers stilled. They didn't get defensive. They didn't point fingers. Instead, they actually started coming up with solutions. One guy suggested a new system for checking the shipments. The assistant manager offered to retrain the night crew. The cashier admitted he was struggling with the register but had been afraid to ask for help. A small smile flickered at the edges of his mouth. Turns out, when you stop blaming people, they actually want to do better. John leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. After that, things started changing faster. My team wasn't just following orders anymore, they were thinking ahead. Taking initiative. And for the first time, it felt like we were working together instead of me just managing a group of people who didn't care. His eyes darkened slightly, a shadow passing over his expression. But the biggest shift happened a few weeks later. A customer came in, furious about a mistake on her order. She went off on me, loud enough for half the store to hear. If this had been a few months ago, I would have gotten defensive, told her we weren't responsible for the mix-up. Maybe even implied she was exaggerating. But instead, I did something different. A slow breath. I listened. Really listened. And when she was done, I apologized, not just for the mistake, but for the frustration it had caused her. I didn't try to explain it away. Didn't try to shift the blame. Just owned it. And you know what? She stopped yelling. John let out a short laugh, shaking his head. She actually looked surprised. Then, almost embarrassed. She muttered that maybe she'd been a little harsh, and by the time she left, she was smiling. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. That's when I realized, this wasn't just about work. It was about everything. My whole life, I'd been so scared of being seen as weak that I refused to admit when I was wrong. But now I get it. Owning your mistakes doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger. A quiet pause settled between us. You know, Doctor. I used to think leadership was about control. About making sure no one ever saw me stumble. But I think real leadership is about something else entirely. His eyes met mine, steady and sure. It's about taking responsibility. Not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. For the first time since he walked into my office, John didn't look weighed down by frustration or doubt. He looked lighter. Freer. Maybe even a little proud. John let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of the chair. His expression was calmer now, more settled, but there was still something behind his eyes, a thought, unfinished. It wasn't just the store that changed. It was me. His gaze flicked up to meet mine, holding for a second before drifting to the window. The weirdest part was how people started treating me differently. Not just my employees, but everyone. My boss. My customers. Even my wife. His mouth twitched, as if deciding whether to say something or keep it to himself. I didn't realize how much of my attitude at work carried over into my personal life. I thought I left all that stress and frustration at the door, but I didn't. I took it home with me. Every day. And my wife. He hesitated, rubbing his thumb against his palm. She never complained. Never called me out on it. But looking back, I see it now. The way she used to brace herself when I got home, like she was waiting to see what kind of mood I'd be in. The way she started double-checking things before telling me, just in case I got upset. I hate that. I hate that I made her feel like that. His voice dropped slightly, thick with something heavier than regret. I caught myself snapping at her over something stupid one night. The dishwasher, I think. She'd loaded it differently than I would have, and I actually rolled my eyes. Like a damn child. His fingers curled into a fist for a moment before he exhaled, shaking his head. She didn't argue. Didn't even sigh. Just quietly started rearranging the dishes. And something in me just cracked. John shifted, his foot tapping against the floor. I walked away, sat down at the table, and wrote it down. The dishwasher wasn't loaded right. Then I asked myself the question. What could I have done differently? His voice softened, almost to a whisper. I could have just let it go. I could have thanked her for doing it at all. I could have shut my damn mouth and realized that my need for control wasn't more important than her effort. He rubbed his temples, letting out a short, tired laugh. You know what I did next? I went back to the kitchen and apologized. I don't think I'd ever seen her that surprised. She actually stopped what she was doing and just stared at me, like she was waiting for the punchline. A small, almost wistful smile crossed his face. But when she saw I meant it, something shifted. She just nodded, gave me this little smile, and went back to what she was doing. And for the first time in, I don't even know how long, the house felt different. Lighter. Like I wasn't carrying something heavy into every room I walked into. He ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. After that, things between us started changing too. Not in some dramatic, overnight way, but little things. She talked to me more. Relaxed around me more. And I actually listened. Not just waited for my turn to talk, but really listened. His foot stilled, and his voice grew thoughtful. Turns out, I wasn't just a bad leader at work. I wasn't much of a leader at home either. Silence stretched between us for a few moments, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that held meaning, the kind that let realizations settle deep. John let out one last breath, looking up at me with something steadier in his gaze. I always thought respect was about authority. About people listening to you, following your lead. But it's not. Respect is something you earn. And the only way to earn it is by giving it first. A pause, then a quiet chuckle. That woman in the store. I don't know who she was, but she gave me something no one else ever had. A mirror. A chance to see myself the way others did. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. A long, slow exhale. And maybe that's a good thing. It's crazy how small moments can change everything, isn't it? Have you ever had a realization that completely shifted the way you see yourself? Let's talk about it in the comments, I'd love to hear your thoughts. John exhaled slowly, his shoulders finally relaxing as if a weight he hadn't even noticed was slipping away. His voice was calmer now, more certain. You know, I used to think that if I admitted my mistakes, people would stop respecting me. That they'd see me as weak. But it turns out, the opposite is true. His fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, a quiet rhythm filling the space between us. My employees, when I started taking responsibility instead of just dishing out blame, they stepped up. They worked harder. Not because they were afraid of me, but because they finally felt like they had a leader they could trust. And my boss noticed, too. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. He called me into his office one afternoon. I thought maybe I was in trouble, but then he just sat back, looked at me, and said, "John, something's different about you." John shook his head slightly, his smile widening. He told me he'd been watching, that he saw how the team was running smoother, how I wasn't just managing, I was leading. And then, just like that, he offered me the promotion I'd been chasing for years. His voice softened, still carrying a hint of disbelief. And the funny thing is, when he said it, I realized the title didn't even matter that much anymore. The old me would have walked out of that office feeling victorious, like I'd finally proven something. But instead, all I could think about was how much I'd changed to get there. His hand settled in his lap, fingers lacing together. I used to believe success was about control. About making sure everything ran exactly how I wanted it to. But now I see it's about trust. Trusting others, and more than that, trusting yourself enough to admit when you're wrong. A pause. His gaze flickered toward the window, as if seeing something far beyond the room we were in. I never saw that woman again. I don't know who she was, or why she picked me. But sometimes, I wonder if she's out there, doing the same thing for someone else. Walking into another store, saying just the right words to someone who needs to hear them. His expression turned thoughtful, a quiet acceptance settling over him. But I don't think I need to see her again. Because what she gave me, it's already here. It's in how I lead my team, how I treat my wife, how I handle the moments that used to make me snap. And maybe that's the point. His eyes met mine, steady and sure. I used to think change came from the outside. That something had to happen to you. But real change? It starts with you deciding to look in the mirror. And when you do, everything else follows. A small chuckle, light and free. Who would have thought a stupid little game could do all that? John stood, rolling his shoulders back as if shaking off the last pieces of his old self. For the first time since he walked into my office, he looked lighter. Ready. He turned toward the door, then hesitated, glancing back with one last, knowing smile. And you know what, Doc? I think this is just the beginning. It's incredible how one small shift in mindset can change your whole life. Have you ever had a moment where you realized you were looking at things all wrong? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts.